I'm Alice.
And I'm Brett.
And this is the Prosecutor's Legal Briefs. Welcome back to the Prosecutor's Legal Briefs. I'm your host, Alice, and I'm joined as always by, pardon me, my co-host, Brett.
Oh, wow. Did you plan that?
I plan everything. This podcast is my life.
I love it. I love it. Well, I feel pardoned. I feel as though there will be no consequences for my action because of your words.
Is it, in fact, consequenceless, or does it carry with it some sort of imputed consequence?
What an interesting question. Maybe we should discuss that on an episode of Legal Briefs.
You know what? We have a podcast called Legal Briefs, and there's been a lot of pardoning all around us. So why don't we talk about what the pardon power does?
Yeah, you guys reached out to us. Lots of questions about pardons. For those of you who somehow missed it, we're in the middle of a transition of power between the last president and the president before last, who is now the next president. And there was a whole lot of pardoning going on and commuting, pardoning and commuting, which are different. We'll talk about that. President Biden, as he was leaving office, it is customary as you're leaving office to pardon people. I don't know if it's customary to do it then because you don't get in trouble because you're already gone, so people can't yell at you for what you did. I guess that's what it is.
I've thought about this a lot. Like, really, the only time I regularly hear about pardons is the turkey pardon at Thanksgiving.
Yeah, that's true. They do pardon the turkey every year.
They pardon the turkey. Yeah. There's a ceremonial turkey that they let live, which, then we all eat other turkeys. But there's that ceremonial pardon. But then why the pardons at the end? I have a thought on this. Well, we'll get into this, who has the power to do that. It doesn't require an act of Congress because we all know how quickly and decisively Congress acts. And so it is one of those things that even someone on their way out, whether you want to call them lame duck or not, they don't need other people to effectuate what they want to do. So it's one of the things that they can easily do themselves. So I think that might be part of it is, ain't nobody listening to me now.
They could do it at any time.
Let's just do it. I mean, they could do it at any other time, but maybe they have bigger things to think about.
I think it's purely political. I think they don't want to have to answer questions about it. But anyway, this is all on the side. Nevertheless, so at the end of a term, a lot of presidents pardon people in his commutations and pardoned a lot of people, more people than typical because he did some sort of mass pardons of people for various reasons. But then he did some specific ones as well. And then President Trump took over and he has now issued a bunch of pardons as well. And so people have had questions like, what does it mean? Where does this power come from? Is it unlimited? Is there anything that you can do about it? Et cetera, et cetera. What about pardons for people who haven't even been charged with a crime, who we don't even know if they committed a crime, which we had a few of those. What does all that mean? So we thought we would walk through this power that the president has, where it comes from, and what its limits are. So don't worry, this is not going to be political. We're just talking about how the government works. So let's start with where this power comes from. The pardon power is located in Article 2, Section 2, Clause 1 of the U.S. Constitution. So Article 2 is the article of the Constitution that defines the power of the presidency. So the executive branch is located in Article 2. And it's interesting, the Constitution, if you read the histories of it and how it was framed, the founders, as they sort of went in the Constitution, they had less and less of a defined idea of what they wanted to do. So Article 1 is all about Congress, and they were all about Congress because they're really mad at Parliament for its behavior before the Revolutionary War. And in the debates, there's always debates about how we're going to have Congress, how are they going to be elected? We're going to have the Senate's going to represent states, and the House is going to represent people, and one of them's going to be proportional to population. One of them's not going to matter what the population is. And there's all these compromises and all this stuff. And then they get to the executive, and they're kind of like, well, we don't really know this executive thing. They should have a lot of power. Are they a king? Well, they're not a king, but they're kind of like a king. That's great. And then they got to the courts and they're like, yeah, we don't know. There's going to be some courts and they're going to do something and we don't really know what they're going to do. And frankly, what the courts do and how they work ended up being defined by the Supreme Court in subsequent cases. So things like judicial review and the power to declare acts of Congress unconstitutional, all that stuff, not actually in the Constitution. It was developed by the Supreme Court as they're sort of defining their own role in this whole process. And so, and if you look at the lengths of each article, like Article 1 is long, Article 2 is shorter, Article 3 is barely even in there. It's just funny how it went when they were drafting the Constitution.
So like one of my doodles during constitutional law, con law in class was like a railroad track that was being built as it was going. And it was like the steam engine on a full track was Article 1. And then like it moved on to Article 2 and it was like some of the tracks were breaking apart. And then Article 3, it was just like a free for all. It was just like a pile of sticks. And they're like, I don't know, build your own tracks.
And then and then in Article 4 and in various other places in Article 1, they're defining sort of powers and they just start using these phrases that don't really mean anything, like what's necessary and proper. What does that mean?
And there's no
we've been arguing
concordance.
about that.
There's no like, this is how you define in a contract. You have like a definitions section and they're like, I don't know, reasonable. What's reasonable? You decide.
Yeah, the commerce power. Like what is commerce? How do we define commerce? And so, of course, we've been arguing about this stuff for 250 years. But the pardon power is actually pretty clear. And so I'll read it to you now. Like I said, Clause 1 of Section 2. So the president, it talks about the power of the president as commander-in-chief, and then says, shall have power to grant reprieves and pardons for offenses against the United States, except in cases of impeachment. That is the pardon power, and that is the full treatment of the pardon power in the Constitution.
So, as we say in interpreting Constitution, statute, read the words. And these words are very, very clear, but let's break it down. So, who has the power? It starts with the president and the president alone. It doesn't say the president and anyone he delegates the authority to. So it's the president alone. What is that power? It's to grant reprieves and pardons. Let's break that down further. What are reprieves and what are pardons? So reprieves are typically commutations. We often hear that term, commutations. Their sentence was commuted. And what that means is the sentence you've been given. So you're first convicted of a crime. And then if you've been convicted of the crime, then a sentence is handed down. A commutation is where you can take that sentence and reduce it entirely or in part. So let's say you got a life sentence. It's now commuted down to 20 years or time served. You'll see that time served. So they've still been convicted. They served their time. They don't have to serve the remainder of their sentence because their sentence was shortened. But the conviction remains on a person's record. So even if your sentence is commuted, you're still, if you are a felon, a convicted felon. You still can't do certain things that we don't allow felons to do, like vote, for example. Now, pardons are different. And that's what we've been hearing a lot about, being done by both former President Biden and also President Trump. Pardons are complete. The sentence and any consequence of a conviction are eliminated and your rights are restored. It's as if you go back in time and that crime never happened. You weren't prosecuted for it. You weren't convicted for it. It is just off your record. That really is wiping the slate clean. Now, that seems pretty clear. This is where it gets really interesting. So what crimes does it reach? Which crimes can you pardon or reprieve? Here again, Clause 1 of Section 2, Article 2 is very clear. It's offenses against the United States. And what that means? Federal crimes. That means, though, that the president has no power to pardon state offenses. And remember, jurisdictions matter here because a lot of the cases we cover, actually, like murders, rapes, those violent crimes, oftentimes are state crimes. So it has to be a federal offense that you are convicted of that the president has power to commute or pardon.
And I think this is one area where people get confused because we live in this world where, we think the federal government is all powerful. We forget, I think just in common life, we forget about the balance of power between the states and the federal government. It's one thing that we have talked a lot about and have tried to really reiterate, especially for those of you in other countries, just this interesting system the United States has and how it really means something. And there are real limits on the power of the federal government. So people think the president can commute anybody or pardon anybody. Like I remember, I think after Richard Allen was convicted in Delphi, somebody had some petition for Joe Biden to pardon him because he was so obviously innocent. Well, he can't. He can't do that because it's a state crime. And that is solely within the purview of the state. So It is a broad power, but it is limited to those crimes that are federal crimes that could be tried in federal court. And if we've talked about dual sovereignty before, you can often be charged of a crime in two different jurisdictions, two different sovereigns, right? So even if the president were to pardon you for a federal crime, if there is a corresponding state crime, there's nothing to stop a state from prosecuting someone for that crime. You have a few cases that go the other way on that, but they're all wrong. And they're not like the Supreme Court. They're just like district court judges who don't know what they're talking about, or state court judges who don't know what they're talking about. The pardon power only reaches the federal aspect. It does not reach the state aspect.
Very good. Now, is there any limitation to this power? Well, it is limited in that you can't prevent an impeachment with a pardon. But it's interesting because impeachment is not a criminal prosecution in our criminal courts as we think of it. We don't impeach like the common folk.
It is interesting that they put that limitation in there because, as we're going to talk about, this all comes from the king, and the king obviously has powers. I mean, you can't remove the king's officers unless he wants you to, right? But because you have impeachment, this is part, I think, of the checks and balances that the founders were so concerned about. Yes, the crime won't be punished. So for instance, say you committed a crime, and for that crime, you are going to be impeached. The president could pardon you of the crime, and you wouldn't be charged with the crime. You couldn't be sent to prison for the crime. But that doesn't stop Congress from acting. That's not a bar that keeps Congress from moving forward with impeachment and removing you from office. So you don't suffer criminal penalties for what you did, but that doesn't necessarily mean you get to stay in office. And I think that makes sense to the extent pardons are interesting because there are probably a lot of people out there who don't like pardons at all, who think, why do we even have pardons? And what's the purpose of pardons? And that's a good question, a little bit beyond the scope of what we're going to talk about. I will say this. I have seen circumstances where pardons made a lot of sense. I'll give you an example. So I remember when I worked for state government, I would go over to the parole board and watch them do their thing because I just thought it was fascinating. And one time there was a couple who were like in their 60s. And back when they were in their 20s, just starting out, they had twins. They didn't have any money, couldn't really make ends meet. They were both working jobs. And there would be times where they couldn't find a babysitter for their kids. There was nowhere, they couldn't take them to daycare or whatever, and they couldn't afford it even if they could. They didn't have any family in the area. So what they had done was they had taken their kids and they had put them in a room in their cribs, with a bottle, and then lock the door and gone to work, come back home, take care of the kids, right? They'd come back at lunch, check on the kids, go back. Well, eventually this happened and somebody knew about it and they called the police. And so they got charged with child endangerment or whatever, pled guilty. So that's now on their record. They move forward. They figure this whole problem out. They live another 40 years. They are all by all accounts great parents. They've turned their lives around to the extent that was a thing you need to turn your life around from. But anyways, and so then in their 60s, they were retired and they were missionaries. So they would travel around the world on these missions. And the fact that they had this conviction on the record made that more difficult. So they there were certain countries they couldn't go to because sometimes you can't go to certain countries if you have a conviction on your record. And so they petitioned for a pardon for this crime. And they show up in the parole at the time, and I think still has the power to issue a pardon as well. They show up, their kids are there, they're telling their whole story, all this other stuff. And so they pardon them of this crime they committed 40 years ago so that it would no longer affect them. And that made a lot of sense, right? I mean, I think that's sort of the ideal pardon situation. A lot of pardons are not like that, obviously, but it's just a tradition we have going back as long as, sort of in English jurisprudence, that the executive does have this authority to wipe away the stigma of a crime for all time.
And you can imagine the other argument against that, why it may be disfavored or why it's a questionable right to give the executive is why have the entire judicial system, right? Where we're supposed to have this kind of jury system of your people. You have the indictment process through a grand jury of your peers. Again, you go through this entire process where your peers are part of the process. You go through all the resources by the prosecution, by the defense, the mental toll, the emotional toll on all the witnesses. And you have this entire process that, if due process is followed, is supposed to reach a just end, then be able to completely be changed by one person. That's the the other argument, right, as to why maybe we shouldn't have pardon power.
So how extensive is the power to pardon? It's pretty much unlimited. You can pardon somebody for no reason, a good reason, a bad reason. You can pardon somebody for any reason you want. In the president, you have unlimited power when it comes to a pardon. And the Supreme Court has said this goes back to the king. So as we've said before, it's funny because you often hear people they'll say, we don't have a king. The president isn't a king. No man's above the law and all that stuff. And that's great. And that's some really great rhetoric. And, generally speaking, we agree with that because we're a republic, we're a democracy. Yay. But in reality, the founders basically made the president a quasi-king. He has all of the authority that a king has. He's just not hereditary. So basically, he's an elected monarch. And that's really how they viewed it. And that's the kind of power they were trying to give him when they created this constitutional system. So a lot of times they were looking to the king. What are the powers of the king? Well, one of the powers of the king is he can pardon people. He can pardon people for any reason he wants. So they gave that power to the president. In a lot of countries, even countries that don't have kings, they'll have sort of a monarch, even though they don't call him a monarch. So for instance, in Ireland, the president of Ireland essentially fills the role of the king. He is the non-political sort of head of state. He is the state. As Louis XIV said, forget exactly, Lestat et moi or something. I don't know. Anyways, I am the state, right? And so then they have the Taoiseach, who is the actual leader of government. He's the politically elected person. He's like the prime minister of England, right? But then they have another person who's the state. Well, in the United States, the president is both the political leader and the state. He is the embodiment of the state. He is the stand-in for the king. And so he has all these powers. And what's interesting about this, and I find this to be fascinating. So the power goes so far that even the stigma of guilt is removed. And so what does that mean? Ordinarily, as we've said before, let's say that you've been convicted of a crime of dishonesty and you want to testify in a trial. Well, guess what? You can be impeached by that. You can say, look, weren't you convicted of perjury? Yeah, I was. Okay, well, you shouldn't believe that guy because he's been convicted of perjury, right? Well, if you've been pardoned, you cannot use that conviction to impeach a witness, which is so strange because the pardon is a technical thing. I mean, it's a legal fiction, right? Like it's removing the
line from your record.
Right, exactly. It's removing the line from record. It's restoring your rights. So you can vote again. You can own guns again. You can run for office again. The things you lose because you have a felony conviction, they all come back. But it's not like it didn't happen. And it's funny to me that in a court, you can't use that. Like if you have been pardoned, then that can't even come up in a trial, which I think is fascinating and just goes to sort of explain how far reaching this power is.
It certainly seems much more like a magic wand than anything. We don't have anything like this in the rest of government. I was trying to think of a corollary, and I can't think of one, where the actions never happen, right? It's like the crime never even happened, even though they did.
And now, look, I want to be clear here. We're talking about the stigma. Once again, this is all sort of in the federal system and everything else. I mean, it would be interesting to see how states would view this. Like, you could still be sued for this. Right? So that's one way where the stigma doesn't go away and where it's not. So if you do something, like let's say you murder someone on federal territory to try and make it a federal crime, we could pardon you for that. You're not going to go to prison for it. You still have all your rights back. But if someone wanted to sue you for wrongful death, they could still do that. That is something they could still do. So there are still some consequences maybe for your action available. But when it comes to actions in federal court, like, I don't know that they can sue you in federal court. That's something that I don't think has been well defined. Right. Yeah, exactly. I don't know that that's ever come up.
I feel like they'd have to lose because of how broad the power is.
Yeah. I think it would have to be in state court. It would have to be in the separate sovereign type thing would have to happen.
At least the part of the argument I would bring is look at how broad the powers are. And because there are specific limitations, and one of the limitations is you can't sue under like a different guise, then I would argue that you could not bring it under federal court. And along those lines of how broad this is, the president doesn't even need to wait until there's a conviction. That's really interesting, right? Because in a lot of the wrongful conviction cases or alleged wrongful conviction cases we've covered, we've said, write to the governor for overturning this decades-long wrongful conviction. But the president even has the power to issue these pardons before there's a conviction. Interesting, because technically you're innocent until proven guilty. So there's nothing on your record if what this power is supposed to do is to erase that line from your record, right? It's saying it doesn't even have to be written yet for it to be erased. So here's how the Supreme Court explained it in an 1867 case, Ex parte Garland. So we are reaching back into the nethers of the beginnings of our country. Although that's like more like middle age at that point in the Supreme Court. The president had the right to grant an amnesty. The Constitution gives him unlimited power in respect to pardon, save only in cases of impeachment. The Constitution does not say what sort of pardon, but the term being generic necessarily includes every species of pardon, individual as well as general, conditional as well as absolute. It is, therefore, within the power of the president to limit his pardon, as in those cases in which it is individual and after conviction, to the mere release of the penalty. It is equally within his prerogative to extend it so as to include a whole class of offenders, to interpose this act of clemency before trial or conviction, and not merely to take away the penalty, but to forgive and obliterate the offense. That is about as broad as you get.
In this case, 1867, those of you who know your history, you might be thinking, what happened around there? Well, it was the Civil War. So Garland had been, I can't remember what he did before, but he had some position in federal government. Then the Southern states seceded from the Union. Garland joined the Confederacy, served for the Confederacy. After the war, Congress had, in fact, there's a constitutional amendment about it, had taken certain steps to ensure that if you had once taken an oath of loyalty to the United States and then betrayed that oath in rebellion, you could no longer serve in various capacities. In this case, Garland he was a lawyer, and he wanted to join like the federal bar or something. And that was included in this, that you couldn't do that because he had betrayed his oath before. And the president pardoned him. And the question was, does that pardon relieve him of that burden? So he hadn't actually been charged with a crime, right? Like this wasn't a case where he had done something, he'd been convicted, and he was going to prison. He had just been through an act of Congress. I mean, this is even more sort of specific than a criminal charge. He had certain consequences for what he did, and the president said, no, I'm pardoning him. Those consequences are gone. And the Supreme Court was like, yep, we can do that. I mean, basically, anything other than impeachment that the federal government can do to a person, the president can relieve through the power of pardon. And as the Supreme Court says here, and I hope you feel just how broad this language is, the president can pardon you for a single crime. He can pardon you for every crime you've ever committed. He can pardon you for crimes that people are aware of or investigating. He can pardon you for crimes that nobody even knows about. He can give you a blanket pardon going all the way back to the day you were born and say, for any federal crimes you may have committed at any point in your life, hereforth, you are pardoned. And those crimes can never be investigated. You can never be tried. You can never be convicted. You can never suffer any consequences in the federal government for those crimes. That's how broad the power of the pardon is. He can make it conditional. You have to do X and then you'll get pardons. Like there's just no limit to what the president can do when it comes to this power. Can a person decline a pardon? This is another interesting question. And the answer is yes, you can. So if the president tries to pardon you, you can say no. And the Supreme Court has been clear on this. And in fact, this happened in one of the Biden pardons. One of the groups of people that Biden granted clemency to, he did not pardon them, were anyone on federal death row, except for like a couple people that we don't like. So those people get to stay on death row, but everybody else gets off. Well, there were two people who said, hey, we're innocent. I think this is fascinating. We're innocent. We don't want your pardon because if we get pardoned, people will care less about us, which we've talked about this phenomenon before. Because you're on death row, you're able to get, more groups are interested in you, more money, all this other stuff. So they're like, hey, we're innocent. So we want to keep our death penalty so people will still care about us so we can continue to fight our convictions. So they refused their pardon. And this came up initially back in the early 1900s. It arose when a newspaper editor named George Burdick refused a pardon from Woodrow Wilson. Now, why would you do that? You might think, other than the death penalty thing, why would you do that? Well, Woodrow Wilson was always doing shady stuff, and this is an instance in which he did that. So Burdick had gotten some information about some corruption in government and published it. And the federal government, not liking when people reveal their corruption, wanted him to tell them how he got that information. And he wasn't going to do it, and he invoked his Fifth Amendment rights and all this other stuff. Well, Wilson said, fine, I'll pardon you. Now you can invoke your Fifth Amendment right because you are not under any pain of potential conviction. Exactly. So, you've been pardoned. And he said, well, then I don't want your pardon. And this went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said, yeah, you cannot force someone to accept a pardon. So he was able to go ahead and plead the Fifth and not reveal the source of his information.
Yeah, and that's a really interesting thing that I don't think gets talked about enough, because people think that you can just plead the Fifth whenever. If you're asked a question that could implicate a crime, you get to plead the Fifth, but only if there's threat of prosecution. And what the pardon does is remove that threat completely. So this is a very interesting case. But going beyond that, even more so than not being able to plead the Fifth, does accepting a pardon imply guilt? And that I have seen talked about a lot here. Now, maybe. So in the Burdick case, the Supreme Court stated that one reason people might want to reject a pardon is that it includes an implicit admission of guilt. The 10th Circuit rejected this, stating that the Supreme Court statement was merely dicta. So real quick sidebar, the Supreme Court has dicta, which is reasoning, not necessarily their holding, which it does not bind lower courts, and then holdings. Holdings bind all lower courts. And it gets really interesting when you're trying to use parts of an opinion to apply to your case, whether it's dicta or holding is very important, because holding, there's no wiggle room. The United States Supreme Court is supreme over all other courts. But if it's dicta, then it can lend a view into the justice's reasoning, and they may not have been presented with that direct question, but their reasoning may give insight into how they think about an issue, and you can read it for your position, but dicta itself is not necessarily binding.
So I've quoted this line before in cases, because the argument you always get whenever someone doesn't like what the Supreme Court said, they always say, well, that's just dicta. That's just dicta.
And by the way, dicta. Technically, a lot of it is dicta, right? Like if you read a Supreme,
dicta.
Yeah, if you look at a Supreme Court decision, they're going to vary widely. But like, they really like to talk, give or take. Majority opinion is going to be something like 20 plus pages. Then you add in the concurrences, the dissents, etc. By the way, concurrences, dissents, anything that's not majority opinion, definitely not a holding that lower courts are bound by. But technically, except for holding, which is at the very top of the opinion, other than that, everything's dicta. But obviously, the reason for writing the 20, 30, 50, 100-page opinion is to support your holding, because the purpose of our jurisprudence is to be able to apply it in other cases. That's why we don't just say yes, no, yes, no, because those kinds of opinions unhelpful to lower courts. So while just know that when lawyers or judges say something like, well, that's just dicta, take it with a grain of salt. Technically, yes, it's all dicta, but why is that dicta there?
Yeah, I've been defending a lot of 922G cases. So 922G is felon in possession of a firearm. And basically, ever since the Supreme Court said there's a private or personal right to bear arms, people have challenged 922G under the argument that violates our constitutional rights to be a felon and possess a firearm. Well, going all the way back to Heller, which was the first case, and then there was Chicago versus McDonald, and then there was, I can't even remember the most recent one, New York versus Bruin. And then there was another one recently. They always say, the Supreme Court, in every one of these opinions says, of course, this has nothing to do with felons who possess firearms. That's still illegal. They say that every single case. And these people will file these challenges. They'll be like, it's true. In every case the Supreme Court's ever dealt with firearms, they've said felons can't possess firearms. But that's just dicta. That's what they always say. And so I always quote this case that says there's dicta, and then there's Supreme Court dicta. It's very true. Anything the Supreme Court says, you better be really sure that you're right if you're going to just disregard it. And the 10th Circuit sort of does this in this case. And I mean, sure, that's fine. And it's an old case, but you see where the Supreme Court is coming from with this position.
And so understandably, other courts have relied on the Burdick language. And in fact, President Ford often justified his pardon of Richard Nixon on the basis that Richard Nixon's accepting of a pardon implied he'd done something wrong. There's like I think, lore that he basically carried around Burdick language in his pocket so that if ever asked about why he pardoned Nixon, he can say, because it shows that he did something wrong.
Now, I'll say I have an opinion on this, actually. So
no, you have
know,
an opinion.
I know. So, and this is just my opinion. I have no reason to think this, but I think, well, number one, I feel like a pardon is kind of like an Alford plea. Like, you make an Alford plea, you plead guilty, you're still maintaining your innocence. It's a guilty plea. You're still guilty, but you're saying I'm innocent, right? And I think it's a little different. Yeah, I think it's a little different from just like a straight up guilty plea where you just plead guilty, right? Like, I do think there's a distinction there. I kind of feel like there's something similar here with the pardon. I mean, if you're maintaining your innocence, but you're in prison, take the pardon. You know, like,
don't stand on principle, man. Get out.
Exactly. And you can take the pardon and say, look, I'm taking the pardon because I don't want to be in prison and I want to own guns again, but I didn't do it. So I feel like if you're taking a pardon in that circumstance, I don't really think it implies guilt. Now, I will say this, the prospective pardon where you haven't even been charged with anything, where, like, so for instance, President Biden, as he's leaving, and just what I thought was a very strange thing, he pardons like his whole family. You know, he had pardoned his son, but his son had actually been convicted of federal crimes. So, you know, and I have a friend from law school who wrote this, maybe I'll link to this, wrote this just incredible article on that action, pardoning Hunter Biden, and sort of like in the light of various different cultures, whether or not this would be viewed as like a positive or negative. And he talks about how in ancient Greece and Rome, the people who were held up were like leaders who had executed their own children because their children had done something against the state. And they were so like imbued with public virtue that they would go so far as to execute their children. But then in like China, under Confucian doctrine, the family and the familial connection was so strong that people were celebrated for protecting their children, even when their children had done things that were wrong, or protecting their fathers. And the people who turned in their children or turned in their fathers were actually seen as the bad guys. Like, that's terrible that you would do that. And so it's sort of this different sort of cultural perspectives on pardoning your son when you have the power to do so. And like, is it a positive or a negative? Oh, it was really fascinating. But there was that. And so that sort of made sense because you're protecting your child from these consequences that are going to come. But then there were all these pardons for like his brother and his sister and his in-laws and all those other people. And I don't even know, I don't even know that there's been any sort of allegation of any wrongdoing there. And I kind of feel like when you accept that kind of pardon, to me, it feels a little bit more like you're saying, yeah, there might be something that you don't really want you to look at, you know? So I think I differentiate between the pardons you take when you've been convicted, though obviously many of those you accept guilt because you're guilty. But I feel like you can sort of maintain your innocence. The prospective pardons are a little stranger because once you've been convicted, you've been convicted. But if you haven't even been identified as a possible perpetrator of a crime, it seems like you're on like shake your ground to say, well, I don't trust that the grand jury and the prosecuting authorities and the juries and the judges, I don't trust that any of these people will sufficiently protect my rights. So I'm going to take this pardon. To me, that's a little strange. So that's how I'm going to like try and thinly slice this pardon cake that we got here between people who've been convicted and people who have not. I don't know if you have an opinion on that, if it's just me.
No, that sounds a fascinating article. You should definitely link it.
I will definitely link the article. It's fascinating. I'll see if I can find it right now while we're finishing up.
So is there any limitation?
There is one limitation. There is one limitation on the pardon power, other than the whole impeachment thing. You cannot pardon someone for a crime they have not yet committed. They have to have already committed the crime. So you can't give them like a license to kill, right? You can't say whatever crimes you commit from here until the end of your life, you're pardoned from. You can't do that. It has to be a crime, something in the past. It has to be backwards looking. That is the one limitation on the pardon power.
That's it. That's not very much, but you did see after some of these pardons came out, people were like, can people just go on a killing spree that day? No, the answer is you cannot. But I think it does get into some gray area when you are pardoning someone for crimes that they have not yet been indicted for, and maybe nobody knows they're being investigated for, because where do you draw the line there? Like, when did the investigation start? How much did they know? Would it be covered in that future conduct? If it's continuing conduct, how does that work? So as you can see, I mean, it hasn't really been tested to this extent. And I think part of the reason is when you get a pardon, what we don't want in this country are political prosecutions, right? And so it carries, we've said that the president gets this power. So it would be a bit of a middle finger to then turn around and try to look for a loophole or something like that and prosecute people who've been pardoned if you're the federal government. States, whatever, you're a different sovereign, you do you. So I do think this is an interesting question, and also a more meta question. Should they be rare? Because they are so broad and they've been exercised throughout history. So this is not like this is the first time ever we're seeing pardons be done. But we are beginning to see kind of these, at least just in the last couple of weeks with the change in power of administrations, these broad swaths of pardons. Is that good? Is that good for our judicial system? Is that good for kind of trust in the political system? Does that make criminal prosecutions or commutations and pardons too political when we're supposed to have these separation of government? And does it actually incentivize more political prosecution rather than less? I think these are bigger questions that go beyond what we're talking about today, but I think they're worthy of discussion as well.
And this came up when we talked about immunity for the president. So in the argument before the Supreme Court, they talked about pardoning yourself, because that was one of the arguments about why you need immunity, is because if you don't, every president's going to pardon themselves. And for all the reasons we've talked about, that feels icky. Like, it feels icky. Like, President Biden pardoned everybody in his family except himself, right? He didn't pardon himself. And he doesn't have to. Under the Supreme Court's jurisprudence, he is immune from any sort of crimes he might have committed while he's president. And now, you know, if he committed crimes before he was president, I guess he would need to pardon himself. But anyways, and we actually don't know whether the president can pardon themselves, though I will say this, given what we've read to you, there's no reason to think they could not. That would be a limitation on the pardon power that is not contained in the Constitution. Now, one argument you could make against it is the king did not have the power to pardon himself. But why? Because you can't prosecute the king. He is immune. He's immune. He is the state, right?
So it would have been a redundant power, you would have said.
Exactly. He can't be prosecuted for anything. So he doesn't have the power to pardon himself. He doesn't need to do that. It just doesn't even make sense in that conception of government. And this goes to something else that I know you're thinking that people have mentioned, like, well, this seems like something that could be abused. Yes, of course it can be abused. And this is something else we talked about when we talked about immunity. There is an extent to which paper does not protect you. The Constitution's great. I love the Constitution. Taken the oath to defend the Constitution multiple times. It is the basis for our government, but it's not the basis for our freedom. The basis for our freedom is the fact that we believe in it. It's the institution. It's the sort of faith that we have and what it says, and the fact that our leaders want to be viewed as faithful to it as well. At the limits of power, at ultimate power, the presidency, the commander-in-chief, the pardon power, that sort of thing, no document limits what they can do. They have vast authority. And so the way to limit this is it has to be through sort of our own understanding of this and condemnation of pardons that we think are improper. As we said, there's a reason the president does this at the end of the term, because they are susceptible to criticism. And so is the party that they represent. And so I think one sort of inherent limitation on this is the anger of the voters. If someone issues a pardon that you think is unjust, you can be angry about it. But there's no limitation inherent on the power to do it. And I think if you try to, number one, you'd have to amend the Constitution. Couldn't do this through any sort of congressional act. Supreme Court's been clear on that. You'd have to amend the Constitution. You'd have to do it in such a way to limit the power. It would be almost impossible to do. I mean, unless you just took it away, whatever sort of Band-Aid you tried to slap on this, I think wouldn't work. And I think there is room for pardons. Do I think maybe in recent years that power has been used for some things that I probably wouldn't have used it for? Absolutely. That is a legitimate criticism. But I think it exists for a reason, and it's going to continue to exist, sort of whether you like it or not. So at least now, hopefully, you have some understanding of how it works and what the limitations are.
Well, this was very interesting. Thank you guys for asking us to cover this, and so timely. I don't know when this episode will come out, so it may not be timely then.
Oh, but by the time this comes out, we'll be like 10 issues down the road, right? I mean,
well, that's the fun of a change in administration. There's probably going to be lots of legal questions that people have, so we'll keep covering them. If you want to give us your ideas of future Legal Briefs episodes, email us at prosecutorspod@gmail.com. We love hearing your ideas, because this is really supposed to be this is our democratic podcast. It's for the people, kind of by the people. Is there anything else you'd like to add about pardons that you haven't already given us very great thoughts on, Brett?
No, I think I've basically said everything I have to say about the pardon power. I will say this. I feel like we're going to have a lot of issues we can talk about. I'm already eyeing birthright citizenship in next Legal Briefs. That one's fascinating. Where that comes from, why it's in the Constitution, the limitations thereof, the theory.
Have we covered executive orders? Have we?
We have not.
I mean, that's a really fascinating issue, like in terms of the force of law, when we've talked about separation of powers and what happens when a new president could come in and just sign opposite. They could almost take previous executive orders and say not.
Yeah. Which, I mean, look, the reason for that is, as we've said, the president's king. The old king's dead. Long live the new king, right? So the new king can do whatever he wants. He's not bound by what the past king did. So that's essentially what's happening with executive orders.
Well, would you like to answer some questions?
If you have time.
Everybody's calm. I would love to.
The house is calm.
I don't hear any babies crying, so let's do it.
Okay, let's see. Ooh, this is a good question. Okay. I actually don't know the answer to this, so hopefully you do.
No. I don't know.
So this is from That Girl 24. And That Girl 24 wants to know, what happens when transcripts are incorrect? Does anyone have to review and sign off on what was transcribed? If there's an error, who can challenge it? When would they notice? How do they prove it was an error?
Great question. It depends which transcripts, because in the criminal context or in the civil context, oftentimes we've talked about the civil cases that can be brought tangential to a criminal prosecution. You have depositions, right? That can have transcripts. Those are pretty simple. When you have a deposition, it's under oath, even though it's outside of the courtroom. Those depositions are sworn testimony that can be ultimately used in trial. Everyone gets a chance to review. It's something like you have to formally say, I reserve the right to review and sign. And that is saying I get to review for accuracy. And typically you're only supposed to, you can't change substantively your answer. You can't be like, I said 2 + 2 is 5, but now I say it's 2 + 2 is 4. It's, I said 2 + 2 is 4 at the time, but the transcription has the error in it. The reporter wrote down 5 and I said 4. So it's supposed to be actual typos, not substantive changes.
And by the way, when I worked in Congress, I was a speechwriter in Congress, they give all these speeches on the floor of the Senate, and they're all part of the congressional record, and you can go back and read them. But what you can do is there's this like little room up in the dome of the Capitol, which is like being in the belfry of Notre Dame or something. Like you're having to like squeeze through all the rafters and everything to get to it. But anyways, you can go up there and you can change whatever was said. So you see the transcript of what the senator said, and you can go in and change it. So oftentimes, if somebody said something you didn't want to say, or you wanted to add something that didn't actually say while they were down there, you have free reign to do that. So you go up there, type in all the good stuff that you want to be in the record that nobody ever actually said, or fix stuff and change stuff, whatever. You can do that. And then from that point forward, that is the congressional record.
Huh, that's fascinating. Okay, well, you're not supposed to do that in court of law. So when it comes to, I have done this before. I don't know if there's actually a procedure, but when you do an appeal, you need the transcript. And so typically you don't get transcripts that are finalized in real time. You can get a rough transcript. Those are going to have errors all over it. There's no point in correcting those errors because they're written in shorthand and it's not the official record anyways. It's to help you prep for the next day of trial. So when we've ordered the transcript, I have noticed before that there were like really big errors that change the complete meaning of an answer. And you need to change those, right? In those situations, for the most part, this is why it helps to have good working relationships with the other side. I called up the defense counsel and was like, hey, check out page 7,800. These transcripts are so long. And do you see where this answer seems to be a very obvious typo? Can we email or call the court reporter together and have them re-listen to that portion, because usually they have a recording that they are recording in real time while they're doing their shorthand transcribing. For them, you can't tell them what to do, but you can ask them to revisit day 6 of trial, this witness at this line, and have them re-listen to it. But ultimately, in my experience, it is up to the court reporter to actually change it. So this is kind of like when we tell jurors, it's your own memory. So if the court reporter listens to the tape that they had on their desk and they're like, nope, I heard what I heard, my transcript's correct, you're stuck with it. And then you have to make kind of a footnote to your main argument why the transcript has an error. And that's not what was really said at the time. And you can tell based on context clues. And if you refer to Exhibit A, you can see that clearly there's a typo here, which just makes it cumbersome. But in all my experiences, the defense has said, yeah, let's call them together and ask her to just revisit that section. And usually it's a real typo. And once the court reporter listens to that section of the tape, they're like, oh, you're totally right. They definitely said not guilty instead of I'm guilty. And they'll change it.
And this is, Alice has sort of put her finger on this. And at least now, I don't know what they did 100 years ago, but now everything is recorded. So court reporters, you often see them walk into the court. Like, let's say you're in trial. They have multiple voice recorders, and they have one that they put on their desk. They have one that they'll put in front of the judge. They have one they'll put in front of the witness. So they have sort of multiple recordings of what's being said. Then they're obviously transcribing, and then they go back. And we talked about transcripts and how it can take a while. And you might think, why is that? Because they're transcribing as they go. Well, they are, but it's still a rough transcript. And then they're going to go back and they're going to clean it up and make sure that it's entirely accurate. You do, as an officer of the court, if you see something in a transcript and you know it's wrong, you have an obligation to raise that, to raise it to the court, to raise it to the opposing party, and make sure that that transcript is corrected so that you have it for any future proceedings.
And by the way, the times I have raised this, it's been I think maybe 1 or 2 times, it actually helped the defendant. But I saw it in the transcript and I was like, this is an error. And as an officer of the court, I have an interest in preserving the correct record. I don't want to win on a technicality. And anyways, it didn't make sense in the context of the transcript. So everyone kind of is supposed to have that duty. But court reporters don't have to file a motion. They can quite literally just resubmit an amended transcript.
So the only other thing I have, Alice, very quickly on Delphi, because as often happens, anytime anything's filed in Delphi, people are always like, oh my, will you tell us what this means? And we're not doing an episode on the defense's latest filing in Delphi for one important reason that I really want to emphasize for everyone. And we've said this before. In true crime, I know there is a temptation to act like every single thing that happens is newsworthy and needs to be covered immediately. And we did an episode on Delphi. It's always the highest rated episodes we do, but we're not going to do it because it's not news. It doesn't rise to anything. So essentially, the defense has done what we expected them to do. They've filed a notice of error is I think how it's termed in Indiana, where they've laid out some things that they think were incorrect through the trial process. There are 3 interesting things in it. I'm going to just run through those very quickly for you if you've read it. If you haven't read it, go ahead and read it. It's 27 pages long. This extends the time to file an appeal. It's sort of the first stage. The district court rules on it. All this is very typical stuff. There's 3 things they put in there. Number 1, they have some video that they claim shows the white van arriving on the scene about 10 minutes after when the prosecution says it got there. Now, the 10 minutes comes from the timestamp on the video, which everyone agrees is wrong. It's off by at least 12 hours, but they say, well, it might be off 12 hours, but it's accurate as far as the minutes go, right? Anyways, so why do they say this? Because they think it arriving 10 minutes later undermines the state's theory. Now, what is fascinating about this, if you follow the trial, you know that their position was the driver of the white van was lying, was perjuring himself on the stand when he said he drove the white van that day, that in fact he was driving another car, or he got there much later because he was dealing with some ATMs. There were all these people on Reddit who thought maybe he really did it. Now that is all put to rest. The defense has essentially admitted, whether they meant to or not, oh yeah, he was driving the white van, and he was there basically when the murders were happening. Now, we think it was about 10 minutes later, but white van's real. So the white van that Richard Allen talked about, just know nobody disputes that anymore. Wyatt Van is there. The other fascinating thing is, and we told you this, the Odinism thing was always BS. And they knew it was BS. Everybody knew it was BS, right? It was always Ron Logan. And we told you this. It was always Ron Logan. The Odinism thing was just to get past Richard Allen so they could all talk about Ron Logan again. In this motion, they don't talk about Odinism. They talk about Ron Logan. Ron Logan was the first suspect. He's the new hotness. He's back. Right? And there are two things in the motion that are interesting. They have a jailhouse informant who, my understanding from people in innocence camps, is jailhouse informants can always be believed. This is a guy who's been in prison basically his whole life. He's currently in prison till late 2030s. Someone who's engaged in a lot of things like counterfeiting, the sort of things that might bring your honesty into question. He says Ron Logan spontaneously confessed to him, and that Ron Logan confessed to using a box cutter. Why is that important? Because the defense, when the doctor said on the stand that a box cutter was used in the crime, acted like this was absurd. This is insane. It couldn't have been a box cutter. What are you talking about? Of course, Richard Allen in his confession said he used a box cutter. Now, apparently, the defense agrees that a box cutter was used. They just think it was Ron Logan that was doing it. So, where are we at in Delphi? We're in the last gasp stage of the defense. They have now fallen back to, yeah, there was Wyatt Van, but maybe it was 10 minutes later. Okay, fine, it was a box cutter, but it was Ron Logan who did it. And Odinism, what are you talking about? We're not even mentioning that. So that's where we're at. This will continue. There will be filings. This is the process. Don't lose your minds. Don't freak out. We're not going to cover each of these. Just calm. Be calm. Patience and calmness is what you need. This whole process is going to take years before it is finally resolved once and for all.
And the takeaway here basically is exactly what we said all along. It was not a bombshell filing. If anything, I think it hurts. It further supports the facts that came out in trial that support the conviction, because the defense is no longer fighting some of those key facts that they said were so important. So I think that's what's key here. Not a bombshell filing. Of course, they're going to make it sound like a bombshell filing. By them, I mean, I don't know, anyone who wants to report on it. We see the numbers. So don't be misled by that. Go read the filing yourself, or just, I don't know, move on with your life.
But you should be mad.
Yeah.
If you got sucked into the Odinism thing, you should be mad, because this just confirms once and for all
they abandoned
that
it.
Was
they
always
completely
BS.
Abandoned it.
It was always BS. And now we're back to Ron Logan.
It was to get to that suspect.
I mean, so emblematic of everything
basically,
that's wrong.
by talking just about Ron Logan and not about Odinism, they said the quiet part out loud. That's what we wanted to get to all along. Now we're just like dropping the facade because we can't talk about it. There's really nothing for Odinism. All we care about is Ron Logan. And so they kind of put their cards on the table here, which we knew was happening all along.
Why they ever went down the Odinism path, I'll never understand. I'll never understand it.
The other dude did it. Everyone does. Yeah, some other guy did it. But the whole some other cult did it, way kind of far off of left field. But, maybe it sells more tickets to the show. I just called it the show
their road show
because that was nice.
Yeah.
Okay, well, this has been fun. You got a special little Delphi hook at the end. Thank you guys for listening. As always, reach out with your ideas, thoughts, comments, criticisms. We love it all at prosecutorspod@gmail.com. You can also find us on social media, on Facebook, on Twitter, X. Apparently TikTok is back. I don't know. I am not on TikTok, but we are apparently on TikTok and Instagram. We love hearing from you, and thank you all for keeping this fun as always. But until next time, I'm Alice.
And I'm Brett.
And this is the Prosecutor's Legal Briefs. Brett is the best. But really,
Whatever.
Is that cumulative?
I was about to say, I think it's redundant. Hope everybody found the link okay. Is everybody able to access?
I really like that everyone knows your personality and my personality well enough to know that I'm not the one writing mean things. They're like, that's not Alice. Alice ain't that sassy.
And then somebody sent an email like making sure I was okay. It's like, yeah.
What?
I'm okay.
Because you like you were angry or something?
Yeah, like I was upset.